There's a special night in the lives of all of us. A night to be daring. A night to be desirable. A night when we can break all the rules and make our own. It's coming to Octoberpod. Everyone is getting ready for Halloween night. It's a time for assembling costumes, putting on makeup, and making last-minute phone calls to your date for the costume party.
Hello? Is there somebody there?
Do you like classic horror stories?
You're scaring me.
Spirits from an age gone by, speak again. The immortal tale of Frankenstein.
Even if you're too old for trick-or-treat, Edward October still has a terrifying treat for you this Halloween. The Satanic Rites of Frankenstein. This Halloween season, Octoberpod presents 4 terrifying new visions of Mary Shelley's immortal classic, Listen to the Satanic Rites of Frankenstein, a special Halloween event presented by Octoberpod AM. Your very soul may depend upon it.
Starts playing Tuesday, October 15th. Listen to Octoberpod AM on Spreaker, YouTube, or wherever you get podcasts. Check local listings.
The sound you hear is a tuning fork, used to induce mesmeric trance. This is the start of Octoberpod.
Every college or university worth its salt has 1 or 2 good spook stories attached to it, and all spook stories contain a grain of truth. University, where I completed my master's degree a lifetime ago, is no exception.
The Choirling Encounter. Adapted especially for Octoberpod by John Iger. The tale you are about to hear is based upon various true ghost stories. It also borrows some elements suggested by The Jellyfish, written by David H. Keller, and originally published in the January 1929 edition of Weird Tales, narrated by Tara Voshell, co-host of 3 Spooked Girls.
The big bad boogeyman on that campus is the mysterious Dr. Choirling. When I was there, nobody seemed to know who exactly Dr. Choirling was, or why his name was attached to all that was morbid and half of everything mysterious at that school, but his presence was always felt. Example: there was a lecture hall that the university had converted into a black box theater where students would stage their own productions, or where the English department would hold poetry slams and the like. But before that, it was where Dr. Choirling would hold most of his lectures. It was connected to one of the science buildings via a little-known, seldom-used maintenance tunnel, and if you knew how to find it, the door was never locked. It was a great place to escape if you ever needed to pull an all-nighter cramming for an exam or grinding out an essay in peace. The walls and the floors were black, and the backstage area was concealed by a black curtain. I was dating this cute little theater major, and she refused to step a foot inside of that place. She said the last time she was there, she was turning on the lights, and she said she saw the black shape of a man concealed in the folds of the black curtain. She said she might never have seen him if it weren't for his eyes. They were pure white with no pupils, no iris. They seemed to glow, and she had convinced herself that if she stared into them, they'd put her in some sort of trance. So she hauled ass out of the former lecture hall and never went back there. When I asked what she thought she'd seen, she said she was certain that it was the ghost of Professor Choirling. Everybody on that campus had their own story about a Choirling encounter, one that had happened to them firsthand, or one that had happened to a friend, or a friend of a friend. Dr. Marvin Choirling had a metaphysical interest in the expansion of the human consciousness for the purpose of exploring regions man could not physically visit. He had written books on the subject, but they were now all out of print. I had heard recordings of his lecture, and it was, weird stuff. His expertise was esoteric, but the legend that grew about him was closely tied to the circumstances of his death and to a strange accident that occurred during one of his lectures. I could never find out what exactly had happened in this now legendary lecture. I asked several people, even the members of the faculty and the administration, but I could never get a straight story that made any sense. And then one night I was out drinking with some friends, then I was introduced to an alum who had actually attended that lecture. Quirling was a miserable bastard, and all of his students hated him, he had said. Every last one. He was such a condescending prick to everyone, and he'd always get off on the weirdest tangents during his lectures. And I'm like, my brother in Christ, we're just aspiring social workers. How is any of this shit gonna help us in our careers? He has the reputation for being some mad genius, but he was just a toxic, narcissistic douchebag with his head hopelessly trapped inside his own ass. Anyway, he kept going on and on about mental projection and how mankind could project human consciousness out into space, or into the cellular structure of a malignant tumor, or to the bottom of the ocean, as a means of exploration. This one day, it must have been about 12 years ago now, we came into the lecture hall and he said he had a thought experiment for us. But the thought experiment looked more like a guided meditation than anything else. It's kind of hard to explain. I don't remember a lot of the details on how he did it. I just remember that he had used hypnotic suggestion to convince the whole class that we'd project our minds into the deep ocean trench to study microscopic sea creatures. It sounds crazy, I know, but all of us were convinced that we had astral projected or whatever to the bottom of the ocean. I still have memories of looking at a microscopic jellyfish thing up close, as if I had shrunk down to its size. I know it sounds goofy as hell, but it was so real to all of us. The whole thing ended when he started laughing at us. I mean, he started calling us a bunch of damned fools and said we were the sorriest class of psych students he ever taught. He did all that, got into our heads, and fucked around with our thoughts using the power of suggestion just to make fools out of us. I cannot explain to you the impact that whole thing has had on my mental health. I've been in therapy off and on ever since. I asked him why nobody sued Quirling or the school after they sent people into therapy. Surely there was a case to be made for mental anguish. He tossed back the last of his beer and said, "You'd think that, but we had to sign a waiver before we could enroll into his class. Something about having to give express consent due to a highly unorthodox and experimental nature of the subject matter, yada yada, etc., etc. And when you read the fine print, the form releases the university as a whole and Quirling personally from any and all legal liability should any personal injury, both mental and physical, occur. On top of that, Quirling has tenure, so he was impossible to fire." A number of Quirling legends suggest that the professor used his powers of mental projection to try to communicate with the dead. I never gave these stories much credence because, well, they sounded like something from a Saturday matinee spooky show. That was when I went with my friend Kaylee to a small poetry reading being held at the home of Dr. Bishop, my friend's contemporary lit professor. Kaylee and I were among the first to show up. It was kind of weird milling around this professor's house, sipping from plastic champagne flutes while they were getting ready for more people to arrive. This old woman came up to us and said, "Hi, I'm so-and-so," and we shook her hand, not realizing she was this famous award-winning poet whose poems we were about to hear. I was so embarrassed for not making a big deal out of meeting her. Anyway, we made awkward small talk with the poet when a little girl came up to us. She was the daughter of Dr. Bishop. The poet, looking for a reason to break off from the two of us, began chatting with this little girl. She was asking her about the house, asking her about the room, etc. The poet pointed to a room just off the main living room. The heavy antique door to this room was padlocked, and the poet asked the little girl what room that was. The girl, who had been bubbly and cheerful the whole time, went really quiet. You could almost see the color drain from her face. And she said, "That's Marvin's room. There's bad people in there." And then she scampered away. The three of of us shrugged and didn't have a chance to react because Dr. Bishop and a bunch of people from the Modern Languages department walked into the room and we got swept up into the poetry reading. The event devolved into a casual hangout with Dr. Bishop and a handful of English majors and a couple bottles of wine. For the life of me, I don't know how Kaylee kept me at this event so long. I must have been buzzed because I didn't have it in me to talk poetry and literature all night long. But at some point, the poet asked Dr. Bishop about the padlocked room and told him what his daughter had said. Dr. Bishop made a funny expression on his face and said, "Oh, this used to be the house where our school resident boogeyman used to live." I asked if he meant Dr. Quirling, and he nodded ominously and said, "Yes, indeed. This used to be Martin Quirling's house, and that," he dropped his voice to a whisper, in case his daughter could hear, "that is the room where he died." Now, all of us, even the famous poet, were so curious that we begged Dr. Bishop to tell us everything he knew about the mysterious Dr. Quirling. "I don't know if any of this is true," he said after finishing his plastic cup of wine, "but I'll tell you what I know. My daughter thinks this place is haunted, especially that room. And I'm not sure I blame her. When our lease is up, we'll probably move. Dr. Quirling died about 10 years ago, long before I started teaching here. The last of my colleagues who knew him and worked with him just retired at the end of last semester. But here's what I know. He was a theoretical psychologist interested in the mind's potential to experience and influence the physical world outside one's physical body. Astral projection, talking to the dead, you know, the whole 9 yards. Personally, it sounds like he's a quack. Professionally, I've heard stories that make me believe he was an awful teacher who ran a very toxic classroom. Dr. Bishop was a little reluctant to talk about the little room and about how Quirling died, but we all pressured him to spill the tea. That room, he says, was Dr. Quirling's office. More than that, his astral projection chamber. Now, I don't have any facts about his death, but from what I've heard, he died of suicide. Some people say he slit his wrists and that his blood still stains the floorboards beyond that locked door. Some say it was a drug overdose. I even had one lady swear to me that he hanged himself somehow. I can't say, but everyone I've spoken to said that he left a note and the contents of that note implied very heavily that he had been conducting an experiment on himself. I heard it was an astral projection gone wrong, and I've also heard he was trying to commune with spirits. Whatever it was, and whatever he wrote in that note, it terrified him. It terrified him enough to take his own life. Then the room fell quiet. One of Dr. Bishop's students said she heard that Quirling had summoned ghosts, and that these restless spirits invaded the house and made Quirling do it. As different as all those stories are, Dr. Bishop said, all of the stories agree on one thing. The last line of Quirling's suicide note contained the phrase, "The bad people are here." The poet, who hadn't spoken at all through Dr. Bishop's tale, piped up and asked if she could see the inside of the room. Dr. Bishop said that was quite impossible. "Believe me," he said, "I'd love to have a good look myself, but I've never even opened the door. The padlock is the landlord's doing, and the landlord has the only key." So, all of that remains a legend, and it's anyone's guess what he saw, or what he thought he saw.
Monsters do have their place. In the zoo, in your nightmares, in the deep, in your favorite horror movies, but not on your phone during an ad break. Politically motivated interests are seeking to influence you through the ads placed on this podcast. Hi, I'm your host, Edward October, reminding you that we have very limited control over the ads you hear on Octoberpod. Please remember that only the ads and promos I read with my own voice carry the endorsement of Edward October and Octoberpod. Furthermore, I and the makers of Octoberpod repudiate any entity advertised which seeks to promote hatred, anti-American or anti-democratic sentiments, or the spread of misinformation. Now, with that in mind, Octoberpod will return after this brief ad break. It's intermission time. I am your host, Edward October. Between the acts of Octoberpod, we like to talk about our classic horror and horror-adjacent obsessions. And sometimes we have the opportunity to interview some very interesting people from the worlds of horror and the paranormal. People like this morning's guests, Amber and Maddie, hosts of the podcast Witches Talking Tarot. Welcome, ladies.
Hey, it's Maddie.
And Amber.
And we're so happy to be here.
So happy that you had us back. We had a great time on Is It Folk Horror? And we are excited to answer more questions for you here on Octoberpod.
Now, what are your thoughts about the folk horror genre and perhaps the horror genre in general and its portrayal of witchcraft and pagan religions? How do you feel about the way they tend to reinforce negative stereotypes or Judeo-Christian norms?
Throughout all of history, there have been horror stories of witches and people like performing witchcraft. And I guess this is kind of our modern interpretation of that. You know what I mean? But that being said, it is so ridiculous when they fall like hand in hand in stereotypes and in shit that doesn't make sense. Like we just watched the Tarot movie. Loved it. Why the fuck was horoscopes like such a like
big thing with tarot? Because like they can go together, but they don't have to. Like they can be mutually exclusive. And I mean, it just kind of falls back onto what people's misconceptions about the craft really are. You know, I mean, there are a lot of misconceptions about the craft. There's a lot of, because we live in a society that is a Judeo-Christian society, right? So everything about witches in pop culture is generally put out there by individuals who only know the stereotypes, right? So to them, witches are Satan worshipers who would have a baby so they could give it to Satan, as in the first Conjuring movie.
Right.
I forgot that was part of the plot, and I was like, oh, why you gotta be down and on witches? Oh, we're not Satan worshipers. But like, I don't know. It makes me curious about what the practice in certain time frames was. Like, because these women would have been in mostly Protestant, Catholic, whatever Christian region they lived in. Their ideals of what a witch is would have been tainted by that. So is that not far off from a witch in the 1700s or 1800s? Like, that actually would sacrifice a child because they'd been raised believing that's how you worship the devil. I don't know. That's a good thought. You making us think.
I think the problem is that, are there some witches like that? Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's not. I like to think not, but...
Well, there's different types of witches. But we're only focusing on the negative aspects of witchcraft, and I think that's where the problem comes in.
But I mean, when you say that, but it makes sense because this is horror. Yeah. It focuses on the negative of anything, even like when you go to Shirley Jackson's writings, right? She talked about the horror in the household life, like horror in suburbia, like her story, The Lottery, you know, which talks about, you know, to keep everything cool in this rural town, one day every year, everybody participates in the lottery and one family gets chosen and then one member of that family is going to be stoned to death, right?
I have never read that, but it sounds very interesting.
It's Shirley Jackson. I have to read it.
It sounds actually really good.
It is really good, but like, so her version of horror, it focuses on this, like, what is unsaid and unspoken in suburban life, right? In like 1950s modern America, right? And it focuses, my whole point of bringing up her stories is it focuses on those dark aspects that nobody likes to talk about, nobody likes to see for what they are. So when we have this conversation, it's like, yeah, horror does bring out those awful stereotypes about witchcraft, but like you point out, they're not just stereotypes, they really do happen, and it's what people like me like to think doesn't happen. So like, it's actually doing its job. That's weird. You made us have a lot of
I know, I'm over here because I was not
expecting
me
to go
either.
this way.
But then I'm also just, there's a lot of Christian horror as well. Like, I mean, like exorcisms and like things like that are also represented, or like the Catholic Church. I'm going to just leave that.
That's so funny because I'm like, in that same vein, that also leads down to a trail of the negative aspects of witchcraft being brought up in those Christian horror.
Right, exactly. Well,
again, it's like, is it true to life? Yeah, it's the dark side of life. It's the doesn't happen often side of life, but isn't that what all of horror is?
But that's what makes a good horror. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
It's
That's why I'm like,
Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a great horror movie. It's
a great folk horror,
and it's real. Like, it was real, you know what I mean? But like,
and it's like, it's funny because I've been thinking about it a lot lately, and I was listening to some things that just disturbed me, and I came to the conclusion that like real life is folk horror.
Yeah, you said that.
Yeah, because based on the definition of folk horror is like people going along with like this crazy ideal, and I mean, if you look at the world we live in a lot of ways, it's just folk horror.
Have you ever had a moment, and I'm thinking about the beach scene in The Craft, but obviously, maybe not as extreme. But have you ever had a moment where you performed a spell or a ritual that had scary, unforeseen repercussions? Or is the use of potentially harmful magic even acceptable in your practice?
Have I had anything scary, crazy, off the wall happen? No. It's not like you see in the movies where like someone's using a Ouija board and holy shit, there's something behind you. But I have dealt with some unforeseen circumstances in the sense that I did a fertility spell because my husband and I were trying to have a baby, and not only did I get pregnant, but my sister got pregnant at around the same time. I guess I was not specific enough.
Yeah. Unforeseen. And that is like, but I mean, like, unforeseen outcomes is kind of a lot of what we talk about on our own show,
exactly,
right? Because like, so, you know, my first thought when you asked this question actually only has to do with half of the question, which is, have we ever performed like a ritual where we had something, or, you know, a working or a ritual where we had something happen like the beach scene in The Craft? And one of the first times that Maddie and I got together, just the two of us, and did a ritual working outside, we legitimately called the wind and the rain. And you can't always fucking say that. Like, literally, that doesn't just happen. It wasn't coincidence. I don't believe in coincidence. We called the fucking wind, it came. We called the rain, it came. Like, these things happened, not just in a movie like The Craft, but they happened in real life to two real witches, like Maddie and myself, Amber. So beyond that, I also have had something happen where I was doing divination on Halloween night. And
and that's why it hasn't happened to me, because I haven't done that.
So it's like, it's so funny because, you know, my face when Maddie goes, my thing wasn't like in the movies where you're doing Ouija and then boom, there's something there. Well, I wasn't doing a Ouija. I wasn't using a Ouija board, but I was doing divination in my black crystal ball on Halloween night at midnight with a single flame going in a dark room with triple circles of protection around me, which I don't always do, but because it was Halloween night and I was doing divination, I'm like, I'm gonna do triple protection. I got a circle of protection powder, I got a circle of black salt, I got a circle of salt, and I'm meditating and I'm staring into the ball and I'm scrying, and I kind of like, I don't think I fell asleep nod out, but like I consciously nod out. My consciousness kind of nods out into the ball. And all of a sudden I am aware that there's something behind me, like behind me over my shoulder. And I'm like, okay, well, we're done now. We are done. I scared the shit out of myself on Halloween night and we're done. So was that an unforeseen circumstance? Not really, because I was kind of half expecting.
Right.
Like, if I wasn't actually expecting anything to happen, but that is the kind of thing that I was working towards. So it was like, it was not necessarily my finest moment with divination. Not that it was a bad thing, like nothing negative happened, but I scared the shit out of myself by succeeding in what I was doing.
Right.
And so like nothing ever like the craft where it's like afterwards, you know, I'm in control of green lights and going insane with the power of Manoa like Nancy, but some pretty powerful outcomes from workings that it was not anticipated. But that said, we are not Wiccan. Not all witchcraft is Wiccan, but I've never done anything that has an outcome that would break the Wiccan reed of harm none. How about you?
Same. So the use of potentially harmful magic is not acceptable in Wicca if you follow the reed, which was if harm none, do what ye will. It's a long-ass fucking reed that goes on to talk about how don't hurt anybody, and then you'll be cool, which is not harmful magic, you know what I mean? Yeah. But not all witches are Wiccan. Now, Wicca does mean witchcraft, which I think is why, like,
many people equate the two. But Wicca was a religion that was created by Gerald Gardner in the 1950s and released to the public in 1956. So, I mean, it is very new in this new age of witchcraft beliefs, and it's a very specific, like, literally, it has a reed. It's lined out for you. A lot of people who identify as witches these days definitely don't identify as Wiccan, and they may not even be familiar with the whole Wiccan read. I'm familiar with parts of it. I am not Wiccan, and no hate to anybody who practices Wicca. That's cool. Like, you do you, boo. I'll do me. But it is a common misconception that we're kind of glad you brought up in this question, so we could address just the common misconception of, like, that is the Wiccan read, but not all witchcraft is Wicca, and not all witches are Wiccan, so they don't all follow the Wiccan read. And whereas I might believe harm none in my practice, you can accidentally harm in certain kinds of magic. Like we talk about it in our prosperity episode. We talk about it in our magical ethics episode. There's a lot of ways that the practice of magic in and of itself can inadvertently bring a disadvantage to another person without you realizing it is down the line in the ripple effect of your actions.
So long story short, to answer your question, the use of potentially harmful magic is not acceptable in Wicca, but it is acceptable, according to your belief, in witchcraft.
A few weeks ago, I was having a discussion with someone who was telling me about a Republican witch that they knew of, and this seemed like a complete contradiction in terms. I don't see how anyone can reconcile those two philosophies. In your opinion, is it possible to be politically conservative and also a witch?
As we just kind of were saying in answer to the last question, that like witchcraft is very broad, right? It's very much an individual practice. Let's just
it's as unique as the witch itself.
Exactly. And so like you can be a Christian witch. You can hold all of the values of Christianity and practice witchcraft. You truly
can follow Jesus and practice witchcraft. Like Jesus, as far as I know, unless I'm misunderstanding, Jesus himself did not condemn witchcraft. That was
Jesus himself was a witch.
Exactly. Like, so there are plenty of, I believe they're called Christo-pagans.
That makes sense.
Judeo witches, yes.
Okay, that makes sense. I've only ever heard of them referred to as Christian witches. I actually have accidentally converted a lot of my Christian friends to become Christian witches.
A lot of them I've noticed.
I didn't mean to. It just happened.
No, I noticed a lot of witches start out in that Judeo-pagan or that Judeo witchcraft, and it's almost like that right in between.
It's like
it's not like that for everyone. I'm not saying it's because they're in the middle of converting, but I am saying for a lot of people.
I mean, and that makes sense because, like, my mom, again, like, I've accidentally converted a lot of people from being Christian to be, like, a Christian witch, right? And so my mom was going, like, from being a Christian witch to just being, like, I'm going to be a witch. And now she's more like, I'm a Christian witch. Like, right. She believes in chakras. She tries to, take care of her chakras. She, does crystals and all this stuff. But she also, recently drew a beautiful picture of Jesus, and that's a big part of her life, and that's okay. And from that same standpoint, right, like I use that to lead into, like, are the ideologies separate? they don't have to be.
Mhm.
You can be someone who believes in Republican values
Right.
and somebody who practices witchcraft. And as I say on our show a lot, like, I don't personally understand maybe how you can align certain ideologies, how you can behave this way and still be like a pagan.
Right. But it's your beliefs,
It's your
not
beliefs,
ours. So,
right.
like, personally for me, could I be politically conservative and still practice my beliefs? No, because I feel like it would be a complete oxymoron. It does not fall hand in hand with my beliefs. But I can't say that for everyone.
Yeah, and I'm over here like, well, let's just end it right. I could not be politically conservative. End sentence. Like,
Right. Well, you know what I'm trying to say.
know what I'm trying to say, but at the same time, I'm just like, I couldn't do that, period. Like, whether I practice witchcraft or not.
Right. No,
But, we understand where you're coming from.
yes.
Like,
And thank you for asking the question, because it has been a topic of my own thoughts recently. How can you identify as politically conservative or Republican and hold these beliefs? The truth is, like Amber and I said in the beginning, the craft, your path is as unique to the person, is as unique as the person who is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, again, like, even if I don't agree, and like, I truly, like, because Maddie's not lying, like, it is something that we talk about offline, but also I say on our show quite often, like, I don't understand how you could be this way and still be somebody who, like, enjoys our show and is a practicing pagan. But, like, hey, you do you, boo. No hate. But, like, it's a good question. It's a good thought process. And basically, it's like, it kind of boils down to, like, your politics and your religion don't have to be the same thing. Mm-hmm. They don't even necessarily have to, like, coincide. And, like, to me, not to, like, muddy the waters, but it's like when people are like, I can't believe this person's gay and a Republican. Like, I get that. I get what you're saying.
I'm only smiling because the
like,
American Dad episode.
Right,
Awesome.
He's like, log cabin Republican.
They got me. Yeah.
But like, it's true. It's like, to me, it's that same kind of mentality.
Right. I get you.
And it's like, again, no hate. And I'm not trying to, like, I'm part of the LGBTQ community. We both are. So, like, not picking on anybody or trying to, like, I'm just saying, like, it's that same mentality of, like, how can you live this way but vote this way?
We don't understand.
Yeah.
Like, that's just the way to put it. It's
much
a thing, but we don't get it.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, leave it to me to ask an introductory question for the end. But how did the two of you meet? And tell us a little bit what inspired you to begin practicing witchcraft, and what inspired you to begin a witchcraft and tarot-themed podcast together.
So, like, our meet cute. No, we met at Mavon, actually. We did. We have mutual friends.
We did. Yeah, I was like, I don't really remember. We've known each other for so long, but
it was a Mavon. Yeah, we your close friend at the time was hosting Mavon, and my friend who, like, my eldest daughter, just a couple months before Mavon, had said, like, you tell us we're pagan, you raise us with these holidays that are different, but, like, can we have some kind of community? Like, can we know other people? Because I don't know anybody at school that like, thinks like us, lives like us. And it was like, okay, yeah, like, I have never, like, sought that out because of certain experiences from my past. But when my daughter was like, can we please have community? I was like, damn, that hits. And so I did. The first pagan person I met was Sarah at work. And then it turns out that actually my daughter's second grade best friend, her mom, was a big part of the pagan community as well, who I'm dear friends with. She's going to be in town this week, by the way.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I don't know. Okay.
So anyway, like, apparently I already knew people in the pagan community, but I didn't know. So, like, this person was open about being in the pagan community. And I was like, cool, I would like community. Please introduce me to people in the area. And so she invited us to come to Mavon when your friend was hosting it. And that is,
I remember that Mavon for so many reasons. I remember it because the fire wouldn't light. So that's how we met. Yeah. We met there.
And we've been friends since
Yes,
then.
we did. And Amber actually had the great idea to come up with this podcast. We discussed it both. We both discussed it, but
It came about because of our
lives,
Facebook
our
lives.
Facebook lives.
I'm a I had just gotten into podcasts, like pretty big, because my husband listened to podcasts, and so then I was like, okay, fine, I'll give it a shot. I was driving home late one night, and music just wasn't doing it.
Well, you weren't
so,
the only one that mentioned podcasts either, because we were doing our Facebook lives, tarot lives, and there were people in the comments saying, "Hey, you should start a podcast."
Yeah, we love listening to you guys talk.
Exactly. So it kind of just fell into that right exact time. Amber's listening to a lot of podcasts. I didn't realize what I was listening to was podcasts. I just listened to the audio on YouTube.
Right.
But the audio of podcasts.
Right.
And then people saying, "Hey, you should start a podcast," and then it just became a thing.
Right. And I mean, honestly, because of the fact that the podcast idea stemmed from us getting together and going live on Facebook doing tarot readings. So and it was like people enjoyed our talking in between the tarot readings, that they were like, you guys should have a podcast, right? And that's really why our show flows the way it does, because we try to keep it incredibly conversational, because our conversation is what made all these different people say, you should start a podcast.
Yes,
because I know some people are like, there's maybe less structure to the way we have our show,
than others.
But it's because that's where it started, was us discussing stuff and people loving it.
Yes.
And hopefully you guys love it too, since we just discussed a lot for all these questions. Sorry to hijack your show, Ed.
Now, tell everyone out there in listener land where we can find you and your show on social media.
You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads at Witches Talking Tarot.
You can find us on the X at Classiest Witches, because we are the classiest witches you know.
And we're available on all podcast platforms and YouTube.
So if you want to see our pretty faces, you can check us out on YouTube at Witches Talking Tarot.
All right, folks, be sure to give them a follow. And also stay tuned to Octoberpod, because Amber has written a story for our upcoming Halloween special that I'm sure you won't want to miss. Folks, you've been listening to a conversation with Amber and Maddie, the classiest witches I know. Thanks again for stopping by, ladies.
And
thanks for having us set a spell.
Yes. I appreciate it. By Mr. October.
Let's dive back into the horrors, shall we? Act 2 of Octoberpod starts now. Of course, I won't pretend it's no matter for wonder that the extraordinary case of Mr. Valdemar has excited discussion. It would have been a miracle had it not, especially under the circumstances. But it has become necessary for me to give the facts, as far as I comprehend them myself. They are succinctly these. The Case of Mr. Valdemar, adapted especially for Octoberpod by John Iger, from the classic tale by Edgar Allan Poe, narrated by Edward October. My area of expertise is mesmerism, and about 9 months ago it occurred to me that of all the experiments I'd studied, no person as yet has been mesmerized in articulo mortis. It remained to be seen, first, whether in such condition the patient responded to mesmeric influences. Secondly, whether mesmerism had any effect in stalling or accelerating death. Thirdly, to what extent and for how long might this process prolong life? My friend, Mr. Ernest Valdemar, the well-known compiler of the Bibliotheca Forensica and author, under the pen name Isaacr Martz, of the Polish versions of Wallenstein and Gargantua, was to be my test subject. Mr. Valdemar, a resident of Harlem, New York, is, or was, particularly noticeable for his extreme and sparse appearance. He had a nervous temperament, which rendered him a good subject for mesmeric experiments. On 2 or 3 occasions I had put him to sleep with little difficulty, but was otherwise disappointed. His will was at no period under my control, and in regard to clairvoyance, I could produce no reliable results. I always attributed my failure at these points to his poor health. For some months previous to my becoming acquainted with him, his physicians had declared he had not long to live. They said he would be fortunate to make it to the end of the year, and even then if all went well. Mr. Valdemar spoke calmly of his approaching death, an outcome neither to be avoided nor regretted. So when the idea for this experiment came to me, it was of course very natural that I should think of Mr. Valdemar. I knew the man well enough to conclude that he'd have no philosophical objection to it, and he had no relatives in the States who would be likely to interfere. I spoke to him frankly upon the subject, and to my surprise, he took an interest. The progression of symptoms for the disease from which he was suffering made it easy to approximate how much longer he had to live. 7 months ago, I got word that his physicians, Dr. D and Dr. F, had agreed that he would not hold out more than one more night. Within 3/4 of an hour, I was in the dying man's chamber. I had not seen him for 10 days, and was appalled by the state of him. His face was leaden, the eyes were without luster, and he was so emaciated that the skin had been broken through by the cheekbones. His pulse was barely perceptible. Nevertheless, he retained both his mental power and a certain degree of physical strength. He spoke clearly, and when I entered the room, he was jotting some memoranda in his journal. Doctors D and F were in attendance. After pressing Valdemar's hand, I took his doctors aside and obtained from them a detailed account of the patient's condition. The left lung had been for 18 months in a semi-osseous or cartilaginous state, and was, for all intents and purposes, useless. The right, in its upper portion, was also partially, if not thoroughly, ossified, while the lower region was not much better. They also suspected aneurysm of the patient's aorta. It was the opinion of both physicians that Mr. Valdemar would die at about midnight on Sunday. Before speaking to me, Doctors D and F had bidden their patient a final farewell. It had not been their intention to return, but at my insistence they agreed to look in on him at about 10 o'clock the next night. When they had gone, I spoke freely with Mr. Valdemar about his approaching death and about my proposed experiment. He was still quite willing to participate, and urged me to commence at once. I did postpone operations until about 8 the next night. A medical student I trusted, Mr. L, arrived to serve as a reliable witness should any unforeseen accident occur. I'd originally planned to wait until Doctors D and F returned, but Mr. Valdemar insisted that we had not a moment to lose. As a matter of fact, he appeared to be sinking fast. Mr. L agreed to take notes of all that occurred, and the following details come directly from his notes. At 5 minutes to 8, I asked Mr. Valdemar to state for the record that he was willing to undergo the experiment. He said that, yes, he wished to be mesmerized, but then added, "But I fear you've deferred it too long." I began the mesmeric passes, which I had already found most effective in subduing him. I exerted all my powers, but no perceptible effect was induced until several minutes after 10 o'clock, when Doctors D and F arrived. I explained the experiment to them, making it clear that the patient had consented to it. They made no objection, saying that the patient was very nearly in the death agony, and so I proceeded without hesitation. I transitioned from making the lateral mesmeric passes to downward ones, and directed my gaze entirely into the right eye of the patient. His pulse was now imperceptible, and his breathing slowed. He remained in this condition for a quarter of an hour. Then a very deep sigh escaped from the dying man, and his extremities turned icy. Just before 11, I was able to produce a tangible mesmeric influence. The glassy roll of the eye changed to an expression of uneasy inward examination, which is quite impossible to mistake. With a few rapid lateral passes, I made the eyelids quiver, and with a few more I closed them altogether. I continued the manipulations until I had completely stiffened the limbs of the patient, after placing them in a comfortable position. When I had accomplished this, it was fully midnight, and I asked the physicians to examine Mr. Valdemar's condition. They concurred that he was in an unusually perfect state of mesmeric trance. Their curiosity was now piqued. Dr. D decided to remain with the patient all night, while Dr. F excused himself and promised to return at daybreak. Mr. L, the nurses, and I also remained. We left Mr. Valdemar entirely undisturbed until about 3 a.m., when I approached him and found him in the same position. The pulse was imperceptible, the breathing was gentle, the eyes were closed naturally, and the limbs were as rigid and as cold as marble. Still, the general appearance was certainly not that of death. "Mr. Valdemar," I said, "are you asleep?" He made no answer, but I noticed a tremor about the lips. I repeated the question until his whole frame began to shiver. His eyelids opened just enough to display a white line of the eyeball. The lips moved sluggishly, and he whispered,
"Yes, asleep now. Do not wake me. Let me die like this."
I felt his limbs and found them as rigid as ever. "Do you still feel a pain in your chest, Mr. Valdemar?"
"No. Pain. I am dying."
I didn't disturb him again until the arrival of Mr. F, who came a little before sunrise, astonished to find his patient still alive. After feeling the pulse, he asked me to speak to him again. I asked, "Mr. Valdemar, do you still sleep?" Several minutes elapsed before a reply was made, and during the interval the dying man seemed to be collecting his energies to speak.
"Yes. Still asleep. Dying."
At this point, the doctors asked that Mr. Valdemar not be disturbed until the moment of his death, or his dissolution, as Dr. F put it, which, given the progression of the patient's symptoms, might be at any moment. Still, I asked him one last time if he was still asleep. While I spoke, a change of expression fell over his face. The eyes rolled open, the pupils disappearing upwardly, the skin became white as paper. The upper lip, at the same time, writhed itself away from the teeth, and the lower jaw fell open with an audible jerk, leaving the mouth wide enough to offer full view of the swollen and blackened tongue. None of us present were unaccustomed to such deathbed horrors, but so hideous was the appearance of Mr. Valdemar that we all took a step back. I now feel that I've reached a point in this narrative at which every reader will be startled into disbelief. It is my business, however, simply to proceed. There was no longer any sign of life in Mr. Valdemar, and, pronouncing him dead, we let the nurses take over. But they quickly pointed out a strong motion in his tongue. This continued for perhaps a minute, and then came from his motionless jaws a voice so terrifying that I cannot begin to describe it without going mad. The voice seemed to reach our ears, my ears at least, from a vast distance, or from the depths of the cavern far within the earth. Now, I've used the terms sound and voice. What I mean to say is that the sound was both distinct and verbal. Mr. Valdemar spoke, though his mouth did not move, in answer to my question, which was, "Do you sleep?"
"Yes. No. I have been sleeping, and now I am dead."
No one there could deny the shuddering horror of those few words. Mr. L, the med student, swooned. The nurses left the chamber, and I was speechless. When Mr. L recovered, we investigated Valdemar's condition. It was unchanged. There was no pulse and no breath. We tried and failed to draw blood. All attempts at mesmeric commands were futile. The only real indication of the mesmeric influence was a slight vibration of the tongue whenever I asked Valdemar a question. He seemed to be making an effort to reply, but had no energy to do so. I believe that I have now related all that is necessary to understanding Valdemar's state at that moment. A new shift of nurses arrived, and at 10 o'clock I left the house in company with the 2 physicians and Mr. L. From that moment until the close of last week, a period of nearly 7 months, we continued to make daily calls at Mr. Valdemar's house. All this time, the sleep-waker remained exactly as I have last described him, under the supervision of the nurses. Last Friday, we attempted to awaken him, and it is, perhaps, the unfortunate result of this final experiment which has given rise to grotesque discussion in private circles. For the purposes of relieving Mr. Valdemar from his trance, I made the use of the customary passes. These were unsuccessful. At first, early indication of revival included a partial descent of the iris. This lowering of the pupil was accompanied by a flow of a pungent yellow fluid, or ichor as one of the nurses had called it, from beneath the eyelids. Dr. F. suggested I ask a question. I asked, "Mr. Valdemar, can you express your feelings or wishes to us?" The tongue rolled violently in the mouth, although the jaws and lips remained rigid as before, and at length the same hideous voice which I have already described broke forth.
Quick, quick, for God's sake, quick, quick, put me to sleep, or quick, quick, waken me, quick, I said to you I'm dead, quick, wake me, quick, for God's sake, put me to sleep, quick.
I tried to put the patient back to sleep, but failing in this, I reversed course and struggled to awaken him. None of us were prepared for what happened next.
Dead, 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 quick, quick, put me to sleep, dead, dead, quick, quick, waken me, dead, dead.
All at once. It had to have happened in less than a minute. Valdemar's body shrank, crumbled, absolutely rotted away beneath my hands. We all looked on in horror as his body melted upon the bed into a gelatinous mass of loathsome, of detestable putrescence. Stick around after the credits for a brief word from some of our fellow indie podcasters, creators, and friends. There may even be some bloopers and outtakes as well. You have been listening to Octoberpod. Octoberpod is produced, edited, and directed by Edward October. The series co-producer is MJ McAdams. Logo and banner graphics by Jessica Good. Edward October illustrations based upon an original character design by Nick Calavera. Select still photography courtesy of Unsplash.com. Select music cues by Dr. Dreamchip, various stock music and sound effects courtesy of freesound.org. Music cues from Bigfoot Apocalypse and Thorax, theme from Octoberpod, composed by Nico Vitese. All other images and music FX cues, except where noted, are sourced from within the public domain. Watch Octoberpod home video on YouTube for new videos each month. Follow us on Instagram and on the dumpster fire formerly known as Twitter at OctoberpodVHS, and on TikTok and Blue Sky at Octoberpod. Or find all of our links on the World Wide Web at OctoberpodVHS.com. For business inquiries or story submissions, email octoberpod@gmail.com. If you enjoyed Octoberpod, we'd be very pleased if you told your friends about us. And comment with a 5-star or equivalent rating wherever you're listening. The man who spoke to you was Mr. Edward October.
Welcome to Brew Crime, a true crime and beer podcast.
This is a podcast where we pick a theme, cover a few cases, and pair them with craft beer.
Join me, Mike.
And me, JT.
As we explore the world of crime, conspiracies, or whatever catches our attention. You can find us on social media at Brew Crime or our website, brewcrime.com. And you can find us on any podcast app at Brew Crime Podcast.
Join us as we discuss the horrible crimes that surround us and maybe, definitely tip a bottle or two back as you do it. Drink with us the second and last Tuesday of every month.
The truth is out there. Follow us.
We interrupt this program for a special report by WKMU.
We will return you to your scheduled programming shortly. Can't sleep? Neither can we. And who are we? Well, I'm Sky, and she's Blue. And dial in as we explore everything from the 1,200-year-old structure, Göbekli Tepe, to UFOs, conspiracy theories, and bizarre stories from around the globe. Tune in at wkmu.podbean.com. That's wkmu.podbean.com.
This concludes our broadcast day.
First impressions can take only 6 seconds to make, but if you're neurodivergent, those quick judgments about you can be misleading.
Because of most people's ignorance around learning disabilities, people think it means you're intellectually incapable.
I'm not Rain Man. Every autistic person isn't Rain Man.
I thought I was talking to people who understood dyslexia and ADHD, but they did not.
They freaked out and were like, well, if you've got Tourette's, if it's going to be a problem, then we can just fire you and get someone else.
I'm Carolyn Keel, and I host Beyond 6 Seconds, a podcast where neurodivergent people share their lives and advocacy.
One of my goals is making autism not something that's scary.
I really want to help people understand dyspraxia a little bit better.
Get the real life of Tourette syndrome out there. Stop thinking we were nothing but a joke.
Let's shatter misconceptions and celebrate neurodiversity together. Listen at beyond6seconds.net or wherever you get your podcasts.
I don't think Amber says anything about the Halloween project, but if she does, put it here.
We should continue the conversation. And I swallowed wrong. And as I went to talk, it just
as that happens to us natural blondes, y'all. We can't help ourselves.
It's It's intermission.
So, Ed, I gotta be honest. Yeah, it introduced me to a lot of new movies that I hadn't heard of, like Witch Inspector General and things like that. But no, I personally haven't gone and watched any of the ones that I wasn't familiar with, because like my to-be watched list personally is I'm coming up on things that I added to the list about 3 years ago. So haven't gotten anywhere close to Witch Inspector General, which is the one that I really want to watch, as that's the reason I keep mentioning it. How about you, Maddie?
No, actually, it hasn't, but I am a mom of 2 toddlers, so I can't remember the last time I watched a movie that was not for kids. I mean, I tried to watch The Meg when my kids went to sleep, because I do love me a good shark movie, but I fell asleep in the middle of it.
I can't lie. Like, I make the face I make because there's something about Jason Statham that just bothers me. I don't know.
Meg? Oh, that guy?
That guy.
Yeah.
Like, that actor. I don't know why people love Jason Statham so much. Like, Corey last night.
He's certainly not my favorite.
Yeah, like, I got back yesterday from your house, and Corey was watching The Beekeeper, which is like a Jason Statham movie, and I'm not a fan. Like, I couldn't tell where the plot was going, and then I saw Jason Statham, and I was like, oh. Yeah, sorry, Ed. I didn't mean to go off about Jason Statham, but I'm sure there's somebody else out there who understands my sentiment.
I just wish I had the time to watch the movies I used to like. Like, because when the kids are asleep, I'm out within like 30 minutes. I'm oh, thank fucking God.
Right.
I say that I can't wait until I have time to watch the movies again, but I know I'm going to miss it. So.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That is true.
Mr.
I've been in and out of
I guess for me to finish off with this question, and I'll let you say your thing. Am I annoyed at, or do I think the betrayal of witchcraft and paganism in these movies are like not good. I don't fucking know. You get what I'm trying to say, right?
I get you.
If they do their research on the dark side of the craft and paganism, and they do it accurately, like, for example, Midsummer.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Then I'm not going to be upset. Was I upset about Midsummer's portrayal of paganism, blah, blah, blah? No. Because it was pretty accurate.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But if it's something not accurate, like tarot, I mean, I guess it wasn't like, I don't know. If it's not accurate, then that's when I get into it.
Right. No, I can understand that. And, you know, I agree with everything you just said. And just to, you know, make sure I'm addressing exactly what the question is.
You know,
right?
I'm like, did I just
It's like, yes, I do feel that horror, and specifically folk horror. I do believe those genres reinforce the negative stereotypes that Judeo-Christian beliefs have about witchcraft and witches and the supernatural. That said, because it is horror, and because quite often they do go out of their way to portray it in what is true to life, even if it is the unlikely darkest side of life, I think that, yes, it reinforces those stereotypes, but that is what all horror does. So it doesn't bother me from the standpoint of they're just doing what they set out to do.
We need more alien horrors and less witchcraft horrors. I want some more alien horror movies.
Girl, they're making another Alien. Oh,
not
God,
like the movie
Aliens. I know,
Alien, but like
I love Aliens. So I'm like, I'm so glad they have this whole like backstory thing coming out, because Hulu just got it's had Prometheus, but it just got the one that comes after Prometheus, which I can't remember the name of now, but I watched that twice last week because I love them. So yeah,
all right,
that's horror. Yeah.
I didn't disturb him again until the arrival of Dr. F. Oh no, skip that. Yes, still asleep dying. At this point, the doctors asked that Mr. Al...
Well, and I remember that, Mavon, because I was supposed to be bringing like 2 quiches and something else. And as we're about to leave, and I think it was either iced tea or a lemonade, because as we're about to leave, one of my daughters accidentally dropped one of the quiches and went all over the floor.
Damn, that sucks.
The dogs went insane about the spilled food. And to chill them out, I ended up pouring the jug of whatever cold liquid it was. So I only brought half of what I made for the meal.
Oh, God.
It was so great.
Squeaky chair, listen to my squeaky chair.